1,578,000,000 won. That's the average price of an apartment in Seoul, not a penthouse, not Gangnam. The average, at today's exchange rate, just over $1 million. Korea's median household would need to save every single one it earns for about 10 years to buy it. Not 10 years of saving what's left after rent and food. 10 years of saving everything. I grew up in Korea, and here's the strange part. The system behind this number is one that most of the world has never heard of. It has no landlords collecting monthly rent, $1 trillion in IOUs between strangers, and a name you can't translate, jeonse. This is how Seoul's housing machine actually works, in numbers. Start with the part that breaks every foreigner's brain. In Korea, millions of renters pay zero monthly rent. Instead, you hand your landlord a deposit, typically somewhere between half and 3/4 of the home's entire value. You live there for 2 years, pay nothing each month, and when you leave, you get everyone back. That's jeonse. My parents' generation treated it as the default way to live. As a kid, I assumed the whole world did this. It doesn't. Nothing else operates at this scale, anywhere. And the scale is hard to overstate. The last full academic estimate put Korea's total jeonse deposits at over 1 quadrillion won as of 2022, roughly $700 billion in private IOUs, floating between ordinary households, mostly uninsured and unregulated for decades. Why would anyone build housing finance this way? Because in the high-growth decades, it worked beautifully for both sides. Renters got housing with no monthly payment. Landlords got a giant interest-free loan. And in a country where deposit rates once ran past 10%, that loan printed money on its own. The landlord didn't need your rent. Your deposit was the rent. But notice what jeonse quietly turns every landlord into, a borrower. And what it turns every renter into, an unsecured lender who just wired their entire life savings to a stranger. Hold that thought. It's the key to everything that follows. $1 million for an average apartment calls for an explanation. The first is geography. South Korea has 51 million people. Half of them, 50.8% as of the latest census, live in the Seoul capital region, which covers less than 12% of the country's land. Imagine half of America living in an area smaller than Maryland. Every job, every university, every hospital worth commuting to, pulling people toward one metro area for 50 years. Demand like that meets a hard supply problem. Seoul is ringed by mountains and a greenbelt, and it already builds upward. The apartment blocks you see in every K-drama are the visible result. So how unaffordable is it really? The honest measure is the price-to-income ratio, home price divided by annual household income. At the 2022 peak, Seoul's ratio hit 14.8, according to KB Bank's loan-based index, nearly 15 years of gross income for one apartment. As of early 2026, it's cooled to around 10.2, but that average hides the real story. For Korea's top-earning households, a Seoul apartment costs about 4.5 years of income. Steep, but reachable. For the bottom 20%, it's 29 years. The same city, the same apartment, and a 30-year gap in what it takes out of your life. Now connect Chapter 1 to Chapter 2, because this is the part outsiders almost never hear about. If a renter will hand you 70% of an apartment's value as a deposit, how much of your own money do you need to buy that apartment? 30%, sometimes less. Koreans have a name for this, gap investment. Buy the apartment, take over the tenant's deposit, and you control $1 million asset for a few $100,000. No bank, no mortgage underwriting, no loan officer asking questions. The tenant's deposit is your financing, and it doesn't appear in official mortgage statistics. When prices are rising, this is a wealth machine. Put down 300 million won on a 1.5 billion won apartment. If the price rises 10%, that's 150 million won of gain on your 300, a 50% return. During the 2020 to 2021 surge, gap investing went from niche strategy to national conversation. But run the machine in reverse with real numbers. Say a landlord took a 700 million won deposit from tenant A. 2 years later, prices have fallen, so the next tenant, B, only hands over 550 million for the same apartment. When tenant A moves out, the landlord owes them the full 700 back, but only has B's 550 coming in. The missing 150 million has to come out of the landlord's own pocket. And a gap investor, by definition, never had that money. The tenant's deposit was the plan. In the worst cases, prices fell so far that the deposit owed was bigger than the apartment's entire value. Koreans have a name for that too, jeonse, a home so hollowed out that even selling it can't pay the tenant back. Step back and look at what this means. An entire housing market, leveraged not through banks, but through the life savings of its own renters. So what happens when a machine like that hits falling prices and rising rates at the same time? After 2022, Korea found out. Landlords who couldn't return deposits simply didn't. Some couldn't. Some, organized fraud rings holding hundreds of homes, never intended to. Korea does have a safety net for this. A government agency called HUG, which ensures rental deposits. If your landlord doesn't pay you back, HUG pays you, then chases the landlord for the money. Think of it as state-run deposit insurance. From 2023 through 2025, HUG paid out roughly 10 trillion won to renters, about $7 billion. And so far it has clawed back less than a quarter of that from the landlords. The victims skewed young, people in their 20s and 30s whose entire net worth was the deposit. And the fallout shows up in the national accounts. Korea's household debt stands at about 89% of GDP, one of the highest levels among major economies. And remember, that figure doesn't even count the 1,000 trillion won of jeonse deposits, because IOUs between households aren't counted as bank debt. Add those in, and Korean households owe each other a sum roughly the size of Korea's entire annual output, on top of what they owe the banks. Here's the two-sided part, because Korea's story is never just collapse. The panic peaked and passed. HUG's payouts in 2025 fell 55% from the 2024 peak. Deposit insurance, once rare, is now standard practice. And renters are quietly migrating from jeonse toward ordinary monthly rent. The system is shrinking itself, 2-year lease by 2-year lease. Jeonse built modern Seoul when banks couldn't. It's now unwinding in real time, which means we're watching something rare, a country changing its entire housing operating system while everyone still lives inside it. So here's the whole story in one breath. Half of Korea lives around one city, so Seoul apartments became some of the most expensive on earth. To live there without monthly rent, tenants hand landlords their life savings. Landlords used those savings to buy even more apartments, which pushed prices higher still. And when prices finally fell, the deposits couldn't all be paid back. The government is still cleaning that up today. That's the machine behind the $1 million headline. And that's what this channel does. Korea, explained by the numbers that actually run it. The short versions of these stories are on the channel now, and there's a new deep dive every week. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.